Okay, welcome to session 3 of our seminar on biblical chronology. Our topic in this session is archaeology and the Bible, and this is going to be a flyover of that topic. We are not going in depth. I just want to give you an overview so you have some basis from which to work. There are a ton of lesser issues involved with calculating the chronology from an archaeological standpoint, but I'm not taking you there. This is big picture stuff. Walter Rast is an archaeologist, wrote a book, Through the Ages in Palestinian Archaeology, and he said that establishing chronology is one of the more difficult problems facing investigators of ancient Palestine, because comparatively few written records were produced earlier than 1000 BC. He said it's also important to know that most of the dates used in Palestinian archaeology are relative, which means they're simply approximate dates. By relative chronology, we mean this came earlier than that, without necessarily assigning a specific date to it. So I think this is a good, if I could call it an admission, to bear in mind as we study archaeological dates. If we step back just a bit to James Ussher, he added together the dates in the Hebrew Bible using a variety of assumptions, and he attained a date for creation at 4004 BC. Now, I can tell you right off the bat that that is incorrect. Whether you agree that he's close or not, we'll discuss a couple of issues, but this cannot be correct because he had a misunderstanding of the regnal data of the kings that we talked about in our last session. So he was unable to accurately even address the numbers in the biblical text. But that's the date he came up with. And you might be amazed at how many people, even today, accept that date as gospel truth. This tiny print on this slide is a bunch of information coming from the biblical text, beginning with Adam, ending with Abraham, the age of their birth, their age at the birth of their son, the date of that birth according to creation date, the date of the birth before Christ, BC, the age of their age at death, and the date of their death, BC, along with the reference from which it comes. This is based on the Hebrew text, and you might see right away there's a gap partway down. That is Canaan, a man who is named in the genealogy at that place in Luke 3:36 that does not appear in the Hebrew text. What does Charles Darwin have to do with it? Well, from an archaeological perspective, he has had a massive influence. His theory of natural selection and survival of the fittest was considered to be more likely if you gave him vast amounts of time. Now, we would understand that to be incorrect, given things like the second law of thermodynamics. However, today his followers commonly estimate the Earth to be about 4.5 billion years old. That has effect on the chronologies built by archaeologists that accept his theory of natural selection, survival of the fittest. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let me ask you first, though, why don't we follow a strict chronology for the early periods of biblical history? And again, this is just flyover. I'm going to give you a couple of points that Morris and Whitcomb make. And I should maybe point out, too, there are people today that do follow a strict chronology. A lot of the folks at AIG do that. They believe they can derive an accurate time frame from the numbers given in Genesis 5 and 11. Whitcomb and Morris wrote the book The Genesis Flood. That's where I've gotten these points from. They make the following observations. First of all, the number of years are not totaled for the genealogies in those two chapters of Genesis. It would have been easy for the author to total them, but the author did not total them. It's left to us to do that calculation if we're going to go that direction. The names and the years of Canaan do not appear in the Hebrew text. Again, that's coming from Luke 3:36. And by the way, that's not a mistake, a scribal mistake or something in Luke 3:36. We have a single manuscript of all of our New Testament manuscripts, early ones, that does not include that, and that's the manuscript referred to as Beza or D, and that the genealogy in Beza is completely reordered, and it's no surprise that they ripped this one out of the text there. Somebody was trying to reorder things in that manuscript. Genesis 5 and 11 are perfectly symmetrical in form. Each has 10 patriarchs, followed by 3 important sons. That may be a hint that these are representative and not intended to be a closed genealogy, the fact that 10 are picked out. A rabbit trail here. We see something similar in the New Testament, in Jesus' genealogy. Those genealogies are not complete either. In Matthew, I believe there's a set of 3 Israelite kings that are skipped over in order to produce the genealogy that Matthew gives us. And that's not sneaky, that's not inaccurate. The author of Matthew just had a different agenda than giving us every single person in the genealogy. And that may be an indication here in Genesis 5 and 11 of the same thing. Information is given in these chapters, Genesis 5 and 11, that's irrelevant for a strict chronology. Stuff that it makes no difference to the chronological thing. If the whole point of them was to be able to add up the numbers and come up with the date of creation, why is this other information in there? The Bible implies great antiquity for the Tower of Babel. If you follow a strict biblical chronology out of Genesis, there's very little time between the Tower of Babel and Abraham. But when Abraham arrives in Egypt, there's an entire civilization down there. He came out of a massive city up in Mesopotamia. There are numerous references in the narrative about Abraham to other nations and tribes. There's an implication that there are a lot of people on the earth at the time when Abraham lived. And that then implies that the Tower of Babel, when people were spread out, had originally only been clumped in that one area. When they were spread out, a lot of time had passed and civilizations had grown more than what would be possible with 200 years, or roughly that. Whitcomb and Morris point out that the term begat sometimes refers to ancestral relationships. I won't go into much detail on that, but things like begat or so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, does not always indicate direct descent and immediate descent. That's often used elsewhere in the Old Testament to refer to a much more distant ancestor, which they suggest may be the case here as well. And finally, there are 2 significant drops in lifespan, which is suggestive of gaps. So you have people living about this long, and then all of a sudden within a single generation, it drops. And people live about this long, and then there's another drop, and they live about this long. that may be suggestive too of a gap in there, because we would expect it to be a little smoother, not a jump downward in lifespan. And I think they're probably correct there. Those are places I would tend to place additional time in those genealogies. Quickly, let's look at a couple of presuppositions, and this has mostly to do with prehistory, and by prehistory I mean those periods before the time of Abraham, even a little later than that if you're looking at it from an archaeological perspective. Even the time of Abraham, we have very little documentation that we would call historical. Presuppositions from a naturalistic standpoint, and this would be Charles Darwin, who would suggest that deep time exists. The earth has been around for millions and millions and billions of years. If that's true, then we have long time periods to fill. So we have our known kings of Egypt, and then we have monkeys, if you're an evolutionist. How much time does it take to get from monkeys to kings? Because we don't have a whole lot of archaeological data in between. Well, they've got to stretch those periods out. How long were the Neolithic, the Mesolithic, the Paleolithic? Well, if you have to fill a whole lot of time, then you have to stretch those periods out, right? And that's exactly what they do. I would refer to that as period expansion. Naturalism would teach that man has slowly gotten smarter, and therefore material culture is on an upward trajectory. We drive around in smart cars today, and they didn't have those in ancient Assyria, right? So we're improving in our smarts. We're getting smarter as we move along. Creationism, on the other hand, would teach us that Earth history is short. It has been short, and therefore we have much shorter periods that need to be filled. You could refer to that in contrast as period compression. And secondly, man was created smart and has been deteriorating genetically. And I would suggest to you that we could prove this by the law of second law of thermodynamics, that things are moving toward a state of stability, which means degeneration and deterioration. We would expect then to find that early material culture will show creativity and innovation that's at least equal to our own. I don't have time to go into the data here with you. Let me just leave you, though, with the observation that some of the most creative and finest objects come from the earliest time periods. Ancient Mesopotamia, some of the earliest ceramics are some of the most beautiful. They're thin, they're beautifully painted with geometric designs and stuff. Their ability to work with stone, their ability to carve vessels out of stone that are just gorgeous. Stuff that you don't see in the Iron Age, but you see in the much earlier periods. The pyramids. That's from the Old Kingdom in ancient Egypt, and nobody in later periods even made an attempt at building stuff like that. Some of the flints that were carved in the earliest Egyptian periods are absolutely gorgeous. Microchipping along the edge to make it super sharp. Beautifully created. And I'm moving on. So this is roughly the scale that you'll find the typical Darwinian archaeologist uses. You can see how the so-called historical periods are quite short, But then when we move back to the Neolithic, Mesolithic, and the Paleolithic, wouldn't even begin to fit onto this slide. They are way, way, way stretched out, much, much longer than the periods about which we have actual data. Interesting that when we begin to have actual data, the periods are necessarily quite short. This is roughly what you would see or need to see if you were going to follow James Ussher's chronology. I believe this is excessively short. We don't have time. It would be fun to go into why that is. And I'll give you just a rough estimate of where I would place these things. I would grant a little more time for some of the earlier periods. Again, this is purely an estimate based on precious little data, but perhaps the flood was around 6,000, 6,500 BC with creation, perhaps around 10,000 BC. We have precious little data here, I think, with which to build an actual chronology. And this follows essentially the kind of thing you would read in a Whitcomb or Morris book. It's not as short as what you'll find taught by AIG, which follows roughly a James Ussher chronology, nor is it nearly so long as the typical secular archaeological set of periods. But that's what I have used for your handout to represent the archaeological periods. Okay, so then to end up here, I got a couple things I want to cover with you. These are the various periods of ancient Israel, Palestine, the Levant, beginning with the Stone Ages, the Chalcolithic, when we begin to see more work with bronze. Then we have early, middle, and late bronze, followed by some subsets of the Iron Age, Babylonian, Persian, the Ptolemaic and Seleucid, Greek period, Hasmonean, Herodian, late Roman, and on into the Byzantine. If you check out the dates on the left side of this, you will discover that there are some fairly precise dates in the later periods. Iron Age 1, 1000 BC. Prior to that, 1200. Those are round dates. And there's a reason for that. It's because they are estimates. We don't have precise dates to attach to these. 1900, 2700, 2938. There's also a varying level of confidence that we can have in these dates. For the later periods, these dates are accurate, give or take a year. By the time we get back to David in the Iron Age 1, we're talking at least a 10-year fuzz on these. Uncertainty. I believe by the time we get back to the Middle Bronze Age, we've got enough play that this could be a century early, a century late. By the time we get back to the Early Bronze Age, we're talking multiple centuries of uncertainty for these dates. And for the Chalcolithic, the Stone Ages, it's purely based on your assumptions going in. Do you think we have long time periods that need to be filled? Do we have short time periods that need to be filled? And I'd be quick to tell you that the dates I'm giving you here for the early periods, especially those that end with 00, are estimates. Those are not dates I'd be willing to give my life for. So take it with a grain of salt. Fortunately, most of this fits fairly well with the narratives that we have in the Old Testament, even in Genesis, can be assigned to pretty close to the correct archaeological period. Just quickly then to finish up, we've got the Second Temple period, we have the period of Nehemiah's temple, and we have the First Temple period, aligning with the Iron Age, Persian period, and the Herodian or Hasmonean period. You can see there the Old Testament, intertestamental, and the New Testament periods. This is how the various periods of biblical history align with that. So probably assigning the patriarchs to the end of the early Bronze Age, maybe the beginning of the Middle Bronze. The sojourn in Egypt, covering the Middle and Late. The Judges period, when you think of the Judges, Late Bronze and Iron Age 1. And then we begin with David right around the transition from Iron Age 1 to Iron Age 2. Then the divided monarchy, Judah alone. That's following 723 when the 10 northern tribes were wiped out. So Iron Age 2C, that's the period between 723 and 587 when Judah was destroyed. Babylonian captivity, Persian governors of the land of Judah, Yehud Hellenistic period, the Hasmoneans, Judas Maccabee, and so forth, and then the Roman period. And here's how we would assign some biblical figures to that. Peleg up at the top, in his days, Genesis tells us the earth was divided. And then we just have scant information before we get down to Abraham, probably at the end of the Early Bronze 3 and Early Bronze 4, and so forth. And I think with that, I will quit and we can move on to session 4.